All right, welcome to Chapter 10. We are going to be covering religion and reform. This is still going to be centering around the early 19th century, those times between the War of 1812 and really the Civil War. So we've kind of been bouncing back and forth and covering all the different aspects of how America is growing and changing during this time frame. And that'll continue over the next two chapters as well. But this one's going to talk about religion and how reform took place. And we're going to start here with our introduction. So the early 19th century was really a period of immense change in the United States, economically, politically, demographically. You also have some major territorial transformations that are radically altering how Americans thought about themselves, their communities, and this rapidly expanding nation. It was a period of great optimism with the possibilities of self-governance, infusing everything from religion to politics, yet it was also a period of great conflict as the benefits of industrialization and democratization increasingly accrued along starkly uneven lines of gender and race and class. You also have westward expansion that is putting distance, between urban dwellers and frontier settlers more than really ever before. And as the technological innovations and the industrialization, like telegraph and railroads, kind of offer new ways to maintain communication, you really see a major shift in how things are working. The spread of democracy really opens the franchise of voting to nearly all white men, but urbanization and the dramatic influx of European immigrants really increased the social tensions and class divides in urban settings. Americans look on these changes with really a mixture of enthusiasm and suspicion, and they wonder how the moral fabric of this new nation is going to hold up to the emerging social challenges that are going to take place. Increasingly, many turn to the two powerful tools to help them understand and manage these various transformations, which is spiritual revivalism and social reform. And the reactions to, the rationalism of the 18th century Enlightenment and the religious revivals of the Second Great Awakening really reignite Protestant spirituality during the early 19th century. These revivals incorporated worshipers into expansive religious communities that crisscross all the regions of the United States, and it arms them with very potent evangelical missions. Many emerged from these religious revivals with convictions that human society could be changed to look more heavenly. They joined their spiritual networks to rapidly developing social reform networks that sought to alleviate social ills and eradicate moral vices. Tackling these numerous issues, including alcoholism, slavery, the inequality of women, reformers worked tirelessly to remake the world around them. Now, while all these initiatives were not exactly successful, the zeal of reform and the spiritual rejuvenation that inspired it were really key facets of antebellum life in society. So that's going to bring us to our second section here, which is revival and religious change. Now, this is a little bit of a lengthy section, but I'm going to get through it as quick as we can. In the early 18th century, a succession of religious revivals, collectively known as the Second Great Awakening, really remakes the nation's religious landscape. Revivalist preachers travel on horseback, sharing the message of spiritual and moral renewal to as many people as possible. And residents of urban centers, rural farmlands, frontier territories alike all flock to these religious revivals and camp meetings where, honestly, really intense physical and emotional enthusiasm accompanied evangelical conversions. The Second Great Awakening emerged in response to a powerful intellectual and social current. Camp meetings captured the democratizing spirit of the American Revolution, but revivals also provided a unifying moral order and a sense of spiritual community for Americans struggling with, the changes of the day. The market revolution, Western expansion, European immigration, these all challenged traditional bonds of authority. And evangelicalism promised equal measures of excitement and order. Revival spread like wildfire throughout the United States, swelling church memberships and spawning new Christian denominations and also inspiring social reform. One of the earliest and largest revivals of the Second Great Awakening occurred in a place called Cane Ridge, Kentucky, over a one-week period in August of 1801. The Cane Ridge revival really draws thousands of people, and possibly as many as, one of every 10,000 or one of every 10 residents of Kentucky. Though large crowds had previously gathered annually in rural areas each late summer or fall to receive communion, this assembly was a lot different than those. Methodists and Baptists and Presbyterian preachers all delivered passionate sermons, exhorting the crowds to really strive for their own salvation. They preached from inside buildings. They evangelized outdoors under the open sky. They even used tree stumps as makeshift pulpits, all to reach their enthusiastic audiences in any way possible. Women, too, exhorted in striking break with common practice. Attendees, moved by preachers' fervor, responded by crying and jumping and speaking in tongues or even fainting. So it was quite a show. Events like Cane Ridge Revival did spark significant changes in American religious affiliations. And you really kind of need to remember this for quiz purposes, that many revivalists abandoned the comparatively formal style of worship observed in the well-established Congregationalist and Episcopalian churches, particularly the Episcopalian churches. And instead, they kind of embraced this more impassioned form of worship that included, spontaneous jumping and shouting and gesturing, and they found new and alternative denominations. The ranks of Christian denominations such as the Methodist and Baptist and Presbyterian swell precipitously alongside new denominations such as the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, for quiz purposes, you need to understand really where this is all kind of the center at, and that this evangelical, fire reached new heights in really western and central New York. And that area really even became known in religious circles as the burnt over district, where really, you've got the fire and brimstone sweeping through the area, and it's kind of known as the burnt over district. Charles Grandison Feeney, an influential revivalist preacher who first coined the term, explained that the residents of this area had experienced so many revivals by different religious groups that there were no more souls to awaken to the fire of spiritual conversion. Removing the government support of churches created what historians called American spiritual marketplace. Methodism achieved the most remarkable success, enjoying the most significant denominational increase in American history. By 1850, Methodism was by far the most popular American denomination, and the Methodist denomination grew from fewer than 1,000 members at the end of the 18th century to constitute 34% of all American church membership in the mid-19th century. After its leaders broke with the Church of England to form the new American denomination in 1784, the Methodist Episcopal Church, or the MEC, achieved its own growth through innovation. Methodists used itinerant preachers known as circuit riders, and these men, and even occasionally women, they would win converts by pushing west with the expanding United States over the Alleghenies into the Ohio River Valley. And they brought with them religion to new settlers hungry to have their spiritual needs attended. Circuit riding took preachers into homes, meeting houses, churches, all mapped out at regular intervals that collectively took about 2 weeks to complete. Revolutionary ideas also informed a substantial theological critique of Orthodox Calvinism that had far-reaching consequences for religious individuals and society as a whole. Remember that Calvinists believed that all of humankind was marred by sin, and God predestined only some for salvation. These attitudes began to seem too pessimistic for most American Christians. Worshippers increasingly began to take responsibility for their own spiritual fates by embracing theologies that embraced human action in effecting salvation. And revivalist preachers were quick to recognize the importance of these cultural shifts. Radical revivalist preachers such as Charles Grandison Feeney put theological issues aside and evangelized by appealing to worshipers' hearts and emotions. And you need to remember this for kind of quiz purposes, that even more conservative spiritual leaders, such as Lyman Beecher of the Congregational Church, appealed to the younger generation of Americans by adopting, a less orthodox approach to Calvinist doctrine. Though these men did not see eye to eye, they both contributed to the emerging consensus that all souls are equal in salvation and that all people can be saved by surrendering to God. The idea of spiritual egalitarianism was really one of the most important transformations to emerge out of this Second Great Awakening. Now, spiritual egalitarianism really kind of dovetails pretty neatly with the increasingly democratic United States. In the process of winning independence from Britain, the revolution weakened the power of the long-standing social hierarchies and the codes of conduct that went along with them. The democratizing ethos really opened the door for a more egalitarian approach to spiritual leadership, whereas preachers of long-standing denominations like the Congregationalists were required to have a divinity degree and at least some theological training in order to become spiritual leaders. Many alternative denominations only required a conversion experience and a supernatural call to preach. This meant, for example, that a 20-year-old man could go from working in the mill to being a full-time circuit-riding preacher for the Methodists practically overnight. Indeed, this emphasis on spiritual egalitarianism over formal training enables the Methodists to kind of outpace the spiritual competition during this period. Methodists attracting more new preachers to send into the field, and the lack of formal training really meant that individual preachers could be paid significantly less than a congregationalistic preacher with a divinity degree could. In addition to these divisions between evangelical and non-evangelical denominations, the revivals and subsequent evangelical growth reveal the strains within the Methodist and Baptist churches internally as well. Each of these groups witnessed several schisms during the 1820s and 1830s as reformers really advocate for a return to the practices and policies of an earlier generation. Many others left mainstream Protestantism altogether, opting instead to form their own churches. Some, like Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone, proposed a return to restoration of the New Testament Christianity, stripped of the centuries of additional teachings and practices. Other restorationists built on the foundation laid by the evangelical churches by using their methods and means to both critique the Protestant mainstream and move beyond the accepted boundaries of contemporary Christian orthodoxy. Self-declared prophets claimed that God had called them to establish new churches and introduce new, or at least in their understanding, restore lost teachings, forms of worship, and even new scriptures, which is just, yeah. One of the most famous of these was the founder of the Mormons, Joseph Smith, who claimed that God the Father and Jesus Christ had appeared to him in a vision in a grove of trees near his boyhood home in upstate New York, and commanded him to, quote, join none of the existing churches, for they are all wrong. Subsequent visitations from angelic beings revealed to Smith the location of a buried record, supposedly containing the writings and histories of an ancient Christian civilization on the American continent. Smith goes and finds it, translates it, and then publishes the Book of Mormon in early 1830 and organizes the Church of Christ, which he then later renames the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Borrowing from the Methodists, the Methodists of faith in the abilities of, itinerant preachers without formal training, Smith then dispatches early converts as missionaries to take the message of the Book of Mormon throughout the United States, across the ocean to England and Ireland, and eventually even further abroad. He also attracts a sizable number of followers on both sides of the Atlantic and commanded them to gather in the center place where they collectively anticipated the imminent second coming of Christ. Continued growth and near constant opposition from both Protestant ministers and neighbors suspicious of their potential political power forced the Mormons to move several times, first from New York to Ohio, then from Ohio to Missouri, and finally to Illinois, where they actually established a really thriving community on the banks of the Mississippi River. In Nauvoo, as they call their city, Smith moved even further beyond the bounds of the Christian orthodoxy by continuing to pronounce additional revelations and introducing secret rites to be performed by Mormons in their temples. Most controversially, though, Smith and a select group of his most loyal followers began taking additional wives and practicing polygamy. Now, Smith himself married at least 30 women, and although polygamy was not publicly acknowledged and openly practiced until 1852, when basically the Mormons had to move yet again to protect themselves, and they move all the way to the west shores of the Great Salt Lake in Utah. The rumors about Smith's involvement in polygamy circulated immediately, and it played a major part in the motivations of a mob that actually show up and eventually murder Joseph Smith in the summer of 1844. Now, the Mormons were not the only religious community in antebellum America to challenge the domestic norms of the era, though, through radical sexual experiments, okay? Shakers strictly enforced celibacy in several communes that they had scattered throughout New England and the upper Midwest, while others like John Humphrey Noyes introduced free love or complex marriage to his Juanita community in upstate New York. Others challenged cultural customs in less radical ways, though. For individual worshipers, spiritual egalitarianism in revivals and camp meetings could really break down traditional social conventions. Some of these ways that you need to remember for quiz purposes were, that revivals generally admitted both men and women, and it kind of discouraged or outright, most American Protestantism discouraged or outright forbade women from speaking in church meetings. But some of these preachers provided women with new opportunities to openly express themselves and participate in spiritual communities during these revivals. This was particularly true in the Methodist and Baptist tradition, though by the mid-19th century, most of these opportunities would be kind of curtailed, and as these denominations attempt to move away from radical revivalism and toward more respectable denominations. Another thing that, for quiz purposes, you need to remember is that some preachers also promote racial integration in religious gatherings, expressing equal concern for black and white people's spiritual salvation, encouraging both slaveholders and the enslaved to attend the same meetings. Historians have even suggested that extreme physical and vocal manifestations of conversion seen at impassioned revivals and camp meetings even offered the ranks of worshipers a way to enact a sort of social leveling by kind of flouting the codes of self-restraint prescribed by upper-class elites. Although the revivals did not always live up to such progressive ideals in practice, particularly in the more conservative regions of the slave-holding South, the concept of spiritual egalitarianism nonetheless changed how Protestant Americans thought about themselves, their God, and one another. Now, to kind of wrap up this last little bit, as the borders of the United States expanded during the 19th century as new demographic changes alter urban landscapes, revivalism also offered worshipers a source of social and religious structure to help cope with these changes. Revival meetings held by itinerant preachers really offered community and collective spiritual purpose to migrant families and communities that were isolated from established social and religious institutions. In urban centers, where industrialization and European families bring number of domestic and foreign migrants, evangelical preachers provide a moral order and spiritual solace to an increasingly, anonymous population. Additionally, and quite significantly, the Second Great Awakening armed evangelical Christians with a moral purpose to address and eradicate social problems that they see arising from these dramatic demographic shifts. But not all American Christians were taken with the revival system, and the early 19th century sees the rise of Unitarianism. Now, Unitarianism started as a group of ministers and their followers who kind of came to reject the key aspects of Orthodox Protestant belief, including the divinity of Christ. Christians in New England were particularly involved in debates surrounding Unitarianism, as Harvard University became a very hotly contested center of cultural authority between Unitarians and Trinitarians. Now, for quiz purposes, you need to remember that Unitarians had important effects on the world of reform when a group of Unitarian ministers found something called the Transcendental Club in 1836. This club meets for about 4 years, and it includes Ralph Waldo Emerson, Bronson Alcott, Frederick Henry Hedge, George Ripley, Orestes Brownson, James Freeman Clark, Theodore Parker. Major players in antebellum America. While initially limited to ministers and former ministers, except for the eccentric Alcott, the club quickly expands to include numerous literary intellectuals, including, most famously, a man named Henry David Thoreau. The proto-feminist and literary critic Margaret Fuller, and educational reformer Elizabeth Peabody. Now, Transcendentalism had no established creed, and this was kind of intentional. What tied Transcendentalists was their belief in a higher spiritual principle within each person that could basically be trusted to discover truth, guide moral action, and inspire art. They often refer to this principle as soul, spirit, mind, or reason. Deeply influenced by British Romanticism and German idealism's celebration of individual artistic inspiration, personal spiritual experience, and aspects of human existence, not easily explained by reason or logic, the Transcendentalists established an enduring legacy, previously because they developed distinctly American ideas that emphasized individualism, optimism, oneness with nature, and a modern orientation toward the future rather than the past. And you do need to understand that those are the aspects of Transcendentalists that Americans actually added to that. These themes resonate with the American 19th century people where political democracy had really became readily available, and the United States was very distinguished from Europe in that way. Ralph Waldo Emerson espoused a religious worldwide view therein, wherein God, the eternal one, manifested through the special harmony between the individual soul and nature, which is ridiculous. The American Scholar and Self-Reliance, his books, Emerson emphasized the utter reliability and sufficiency of the individual soul and exhorted his audience to overcome our long apprenticeship to the learnings of our land. Emerson believed that the time had come for Americans to declare their intellectual independence from Europe. Thoreau espoused very similar enthusiasm for simple living and communion with nature and self-sufficiency. Thoreau's sense of rugged individualism, perhaps the strongest among any transcendentalist, also yielded a resistance to civil government. Several of the transcendentalists also participated in communal living experiences, and many different types of response to these religious turmoils of the time had similar endpoints with the embrace of voluntary associations and social reform work. During the antebellum period, many American Christians responded to moral anxiety of industrialization and urbanization by organizing to address specific social needs. Social problems such as intemperance, vice, and crime assumed a new and distressing scale that older solutions such as almshouses were not equipped to handle. Moralists really grow concerned about the growing mass of urban residents who did not attend church and who, thanks to poverty or illiteracy, did not even have access to Scripture. Voluntary benevolent societies explode in number in order to try and tackle these issues. These are led by ministers and dominated by middle-class women. Voluntary societies printed and distributed Protestant tracts, taught Sunday schools, distributed outdoor relief, evangelized in both frontier towns and urban slums. These associations and their evangelical members also lend moral backing and workers to large-scale social reform projects, including the temperance movement, which was designed to curb Americans' consumption of alcohol, the abolitionist campaign to eradicate slavery, and women's rights agitation to improve women's political and economic rights. As such wide-ranging reform projects combined with missionary zeal, evangelical Christians formed a benevolent empire that swiftly became the cornerstone of the antebellum period.